Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about another work of labor studies. In this case, it's a labor history by Sharon McConnell-Sidorick, really good historian and who wrote a very, very interesting book about union members, radical unionists, but also just regular union activists in Kensington and Philly in really the period between the First and the Second World War. So focused a lot on the Great Depression, but also the 1920s. The book's called SILK Stockings and Socialism, Philadelphia's Radical Hosiery Workers from the Jazz Age to the New Deal. I will say the socialism part isn't clear. These are radical unionists, and some of them certainly were socialists, but that's not really the main focus of the book. I think what makes this book relevant for us now is that it really enters into this conversation about the relationship between class politics and identity politics, and it shows how really joined these are and how you can't just sort of separate them too much. So the book was published by University of North Carolina Press, which is a very, very good press for labor studies, for labor history in particular. I think it's the best whenever you pick up a really top-notch labor history. There's a good chance it's University of North Carolina Press. They're not all published there, but it is a really solid press for that. Sharon McConnell-Sidorick is an independent scholar in Philly, and she really knows the situation in Philly very well, its history, and she was able to do a lot of local research and local archives and oral histories and things like that. The main topic, the main union that this focuses on, as many labor studies, labor histories do, is focus on like one group of workers and their efforts to organize or mobilize into unions. Not all do that, but it's kind of a common approach. One reason being these unions have records which can be studied by historians. Non-unionized workers are a bit harder to study. I'll certainly look at works in the future that deal with non-unionized workers, but this one does do that. It deals with a lot of themes that I think are very familiar to people who studied labor history before or read some of this stuff. Like I'm thinking especially of Elizabeth Cohen's works on Chicago. So kind of looking at that context, like bridging the 20s and the 30s and seeing the radicalism of workers in the 30s in the New Deal era, connecting them to class politics in the 20s and society, community, culture, and all that kind of stuff. But it's a really good book. It was published about 2 years ago, so 2017. So yeah, that's it. The focus is on the American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers. I'm not too much up on the actual technical process of what makes something full-fashioned versus another type of cut. It has to do with the machinery that was done, the style of stockings that were made at the time. Now, it doesn't just deal with women workers, although there's a really clear turn in the book in the second half and even the second 2/3 where the focus becomes much more on feminism and union workers. In fact, the title might be a little bit misleading, I think. Silk Stockings and Socialism. There is socialism themes here, but I think feminism is actually a stronger theme, and Silk Stockings and Feminism might be a little bit more accurate, even though it, in some ways, maybe that would have been too obvious or something. I don't see the socialism being as much of a strong theme as the question of social justice. And before I get into the book a little bit more, what I really want to say about this is, and what I like about this book, is it connects to these themes that are so relevant today in even center-left politics, but certainly in leftist politics too, what's called intersectionalism, and that is how class politics can be tied to identity politics and how necessary it is to join class politics with identity politics. They're not separable, really. It's not an either-or kind of thing. And that's what this union, the AFFHO, the American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers, it's what they realized in the 20s, especially in the 30s, was the importance of feminism in their struggle. Okay, another thing this book does very, very well is talk about the culture of these radical unionists. And she starts out like a really, very conventional labor history that we've been used to, where you'll start, like, you look at the community, right? That's something that's been very popular in labor histories since even E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, a book I'm really considering taking a closer look at. I noticed there's not too many reviews of that on YouTube, so I think it might be worth throwing one on there, maybe a multi-part one, because it is such an important book. But ever since then, there's been that culture turn in labor studies where you don't look at just the institutional history of unions, for instance. You look instead at the culture that was the social foundation for the working class. And then what a lot of American labor historians realized, or historians of American labor, I mean, what they realized is unions that were very successful, very powerful, able to really mobilize to win strikes, often had very strong community support. So she does a really good job of tying into the history of Kensington. She even starts the book talking about the Knights of Labor and how there was this long radical tradition among Philadelphia workers going way back, and that these women, men and women in the AFFHW, I'll try to get that right every time, how they had this genealogy going back to the Knights of Labor. That's really cool and interesting stuff here. The other thing where she ties this to, especially the 20s culture of working class women, and I urge you to look at Kathy Pice's book, Cheap Amusements. I think that goes back a little bit before the 20s, but it shows just how important consumer culture and participating in the culture of amusements, whether it's Coney Island or the dance halls or things like that, was to working class women. And it wasn't a separable thing from the working class struggle. Now, Kathy Pice focuses mostly on their social life and their cultural life. McConnell-Sidorick here really pushes it and says that really the foundation of their radicalism was in some ways tied to their participation in consumer culture in a way. And she's got kind of this feminism and flapper motif running through the book, which is really cool. It reminds me a lot of Elizabeth Cohen's work on Chicago workers in the way she shows how the desire to participate in mass culture of the 20s tied to labor radicalism in the 30s, right? And how it was this demand to consume. And some other people have written about, and actually I think this is in Elizabeth Cohen's other book on Consumer Republic or whatever, how she talks about how even civil rights activists were really basing their claims on the right to consume, right? And that was part of the breaking down of Jim Crow, was the right to participate in consumer society on more of a foundation of equality. It's been a while since I looked at that book, but we'll maybe get to that too. So I think she uses a lot of contemporary phraseology here, which I think can be very enlightening for readers. For instance, she talks about social justice unionism, right? And you think about the conversation about social justice warriors, or what's the role of social justice and especially identity politics in unionism or in class politics. And she just goes right to the heart of it and says these are really joined together. Another way she uses very contemporary language is when she talks about thinking globally, acting locally, something that this union figured out during the Great Depression. And I think that's another really strong part to it. As for how she researched this book, she's really of Philly, and you can really get that sense of this book. Her sources come from local archives. She has a little bit more of a national, at least, take. She does talk a little bit global too, but really a national picture. She even talks about the Kenosha, Wisconsin mobilization of hosiery workers there, because this was this union was national, but it was really powerful in Philly. That's why she focuses on it. So she's got all those archives of the unions that she relies on, their publications, and she's got a lot of oral histories, and that's where you really get the sense that she really knew the labor history of Philly very well, because she was able to talk to these people, or sometimes there were even oral traditions where she was able to talk to people whose mother or other family members were involved in these strikes. And that's kind of a distinctive aspect of this book that I think will make it attractive to some readers. I know some of you may see that as a little bit more anecdotal in the history, but it really gives a lot of nice flavor to it, and you're getting the voice of these workers, not just from the union documents, and that's a great part of this work. So let me run through the content of the book. It's not very long without the footnotes. It's about 220 pages with the footnotes. It goes up to about 280 or so. So it's a quick read, but there's a lot of richness in it. So it is a book worth taking your time studying. She starts out going back to the Knights of Labor and talking about the community of Kensington and the working class community in Philly, and she talks about the cultural networks. And this is a pretty standard approach in labor studies, as I suggested, where when you want to understand why a union emerged or where labor solidarity came from. You want to study the community. Was it an immigrant community? Was it, was it religiously motivated? Was it diverse? Was it a more traditional kind of patriarchal kind of working class? So were there women in the workforce? And she talks about all that stuff, and that's good stuff. But I think she really focuses here on two things that I noticed and that really struck out to me. And that one was the traditions of gender politics and how there was kind of a gender politics already rooted in the community, which was something that could be mobilized in the 20s and 30s in these labor struggles. And then she talks also about traditions of resistance, right? Because when you want to understand she wants to understand where the desire to form unions comes from, and she also wants to understand where the desire to engage in feminism, working class feminism, came from. And she sees these all rooted in the community going away far back. And after talking about that, she moves into the question of how did the hosiery unions emerge? And it really is in and around World War I. And she calls these struggles for survival really brutal strikes, kind of life and death strikes for livelihood. Of course, you have the post-war situation, which was really hard on workers. She writes here, quote, "When the war ended, working class consumers were hard hit by runaway inflation, which doubled the prices working families had to pay for many necessities compared to those before the war. And as employers attempted to push back gains their workers made during the war, the country erupted in rebellion, but not always directed against employers. Although Philly escaped the serious racial disorders that affected Chicago, East St. Louis, and other cities, it was not immune from social upheavals that rocked many American communities after the war." And then she even talks about repression, and that, of course, ties to the Red Scare and the repression of radical unionist and socialist movements in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Traditional stuff we know of in American labor history. So it's in this context that the hosiery workers first mobilized, right? And you look at this book, you got this iconography, this feminist iconography, very classic. It turns out in the hosiery unions. She talks a little bit about it in the book later on. You think this is going to be about women, and in many ways it is. The second half of the book is about women workers, but the first third or so does deal a lot with male workers as well, because many of these silk stockings were made by male workers as well. And so I think that's what made the entrance into social justice issues so key in her mind, was the importance of really joining as the industry became more feminized, right? It became more female. To be successful, it had to engage in feminist politics. That's what I'm trying to say. But that's not the focus early on in the book. It really is this brutal, contentious period of time around World War I. And then after talking about the growth of the hosiery union in the context of the late teens, early 20s, she moves on to get into a chapter focusing on the youth militants of the Jazz Age. That's the name of the chapter. And here you're really, really reminded of Elizabeth Cohen's work on the making of the New Deal. It's such an important book to look at in the context of this story, where she argues, mostly for male workers in Chicago, how participation in mass culture and consumer culture became the springboard for more radical union activities in the 30s, right? So she builds off that. And what she gets to here is the radicalization of youth culture. And a lot of that came out of women's participation in consumer politics. It's kind of how she put it, the feminism and flappers continuity. And in here she's kind of picking at, and she does this quite consciously and directly in the book, is she picks on some historians who maybe not purposely neglected, but just didn't focus on working class feminism so much. And this is especially common in earlier histories of like the suffragist movement, the feminist movement, focus on more on those middle class women, the new woman, not the modern girl. The modern girl is being seen largely as a more apolitical phenomenon. But she doesn't, McConnell-Sidorick here doesn't think we should neglect the politics of the flapper, essentially. So that's what she really gets to as we get towards the middle of the book, is this radicalization of the youth culture, and then the way the AFFFHW, this American Federation of Full-Fashion Hosiery Workers, was able to really take advantage of this radicalized youth culture through things like dances and participating in that culture a little bit, and really being something attractive to these workers. So they were able to mobilize this youth culture, and the youth culture was able to give a lot of life to the union, and I think that's a really great thing, especially when you think about the kind of the struggles that younger workers are facing today, where they are very much in mass culture and social media. They're experiencing things a little bit differently than older workers. They see the world a little bit differently. That doesn't mean there can't be solidarity, but it does require some consciousness by the union to partake in that, right? To build off of that. Now, of course, it won't be the same. It won't be dances or those kinds of things. But there has to be that conversation. And McConnell-Sidorick doesn't really talk about this directly, but as I read it, I kept thinking about how important it is for the labor movement to really get these younger workers on board. And I think that's increasingly happening. But we see here an example of that same dialogue between the mass culture that's emerging, which isn't necessarily about unions necessarily, but it was something that could be, there was an alliance there, a common alliance there, and it took identity politics, it took feminism to join these two things together. So it's, in a way, the union was able to bring social justice cause to the fight for these traditional labor issues. Here's what she writes on this. This is on page 80, chapter 3. While the American youth culture of the period had common features everywhere it was found, Kensington's young people lived in a particular community, and the space that surrounded them was comprised not only of places of leisure, but also places of work, union halls, and family and neighbors, many of whom had participated in the battles of the past. The young workers participated not only in the consumer culture, but also in the community culture. They gave parties for pure fun, but also to welcome back a co-worker after several months from the hospital, or to raise money for someone's loss of a family member. And while some hosiery workers may have had relatively high wages than others in the neighborhood, this did not separate them from the community, for much of their income was put back into it in contributions to the family economy and services offered to neighbors, as well as in consumer purchases. And just a page later, she's able to talk about how this even allowed alliances between young men and young female workers, young male and young female workers, as they both participate in this emerging mass culture. And that was also grounds for solidarity. She writes, while relations between young men and women often revolved around fun and had sexual undertones, there was also, as Susan Glenn argued, a notion of partnership and a co-participation with men along class and community lines. This is demonstrated not only by the excerpts from the press-off special discussed earlier, but also in the participation of women in strikes, as in 1919 and 1921, when many women walked out in support of men. They were not in the union themselves at the time. So this is really key to her whole argument, it seems to me, as I understand it. And that's, I think, what really makes it relevant is there's so much need for solidarity across identity politics as we make a struggle against capitalism, or even just for dignity and for the right to have a decent living standard. Something, even things like a minimum wage getting increased. It hasn't been increased in decades almost. So that the identity politics can't be a distraction, it can be a weapon. And I think that's what she's arguing here. In fact, part of me wishes she would be more conscious about this relevance of this work, because you might read this and think, well, this is just a labor history. But no, I think it does have a lot to teach people for our struggles, teach us for our struggles today. Well, anyways, after talking about this, so she's really laying the foundation here, both institutionally in the union and then in the community culture. And then the second half of the book, the focus is on the Great Depression years. And so she has a chapter on feminist unionism, which is, again, very, very key. And this kind of brings these two themes together. The kind of the flapper militant, the flapper feminist, with the working class woman, right? Because the flappers were working class, by and large. They weren't these middle class suffragists that we're so familiar with in traditional feminist history. So this is a chapter really about the working class feminist, right? And we see how the shift in the Union took advantage of this to focus more and more on working class women. And then this is when we get this feminist iconography, and this cover has this image. It's reproduced in the book too, which really tries to exemplify it. It's a great picture you see here, a woman holding the silk stockings with this nice modernist industrial urban background. So with all that in place, we can move into the Great Depression, which is the climax of her story. She shows how Kensington was hit really hard in the Great Depression, relatively higher unemployment rates than the rest of the countries. And the response of the hosiery workers was organization. She even has an epigraph to one of these chapters, which is just so powerful. This is right at the beginning of chapter 5. At a time when most unions say, lay low, because times are bad, the hosiery workers reply, oh yeah, let's organize. I love that quote because it's got that kind of chip on the shoulder kind of attitude, that kind of working class confrontational attitude, as well as emphasizing that the Great Depression was not the time to just eat whatever shit the bosses gave you. It was the time to organize. And we see the workers, some of the greatest gains in American labor history were made in the Great Depression at a time when you had high unemployment. So it's when we see the rise of the CIO, of course, which is, of course, part of this story as well. So activism peaks in like the years 1931 to 1933. For her, she carries on the story until the late 30s, but that really seems to be the peak. And that, of course, nationally with labor unions, the focus of activism was in those years. She even meant another term she uses, which is very contemporary, is she talks about affirmative action and how the hosiery workers demanded something we would now call affirmative action, even though they didn't call it at the time. She writes, the women were demanding what would later years be defined as affirmative action, but they did not use the language of correcting past wrongs. There had been a growing recognition of the special problem that many women faced when attempting to increase their activism, and clearly the institution of separate women's meetings indicated that they recognized the need for support groups. But while such meetings facilitated consciousness raising and solidarity among women, the ideology that leadership should be vested in male knitters was slow to change within the top hierarchy of the union. Now this is something we observe a lot in American history, whether it was Freedom Summer, in which women were mobilized to participate in the civil rights struggle, but they often felt sidelined by male leaders, or just even in the abolitionist movement. We've seen this theme a lot, where women get mobilized for a social movement, but they're not allowed to participate as equals within the movement, and this radicalizes them as feminists, right? And the solution isn't to fight against that. The solution is actually to use that energy and that growing consciousness for your struggle, and that's what she shows that the AFF-FHW was able to do to some degree, and that's why she talks about social justice unionism here. And that's really what she means by it. When she even quotes here, I mentioned this before, thinking globally, acting locally. I don't see the global dimension so much, but what she's talking about here is unions, and this union in particular, realizing that their demands and their concerns are broader than just their local meat and potato issues, in that city or in that factory or whatever, that there are broader issues. And so that is where the support for social justice becomes so relevant. And this is where you get conversations of socialism. And I think there you maybe do get a more global understanding of their struggles through socialism. The aiding the unemployed workers movement, very, very key in places like Detroit, but also in Philly, where there was much higher than average unemployment rates. So that part of it is how, without that social justice foundation, it's not as likely that these unions would have been able to fight the class politics as effectively as they did. That's basically the book. She carries on she's got a separate chapter in the New Deal era, but it also really described the peak of this particular union. And her argument really centers on working class power being rooted in in both unions and in communities and in social justice, mostly articulated in this flapper feminism of many of the women workers that were in the union. I guess the true climax of this is the description she gives of the strike wave of 1933, which I guess is the pinnacle of this particular story that she's trying to tell. So anyways, I'm very much a fan of this book, and I urge you to read it if you're interested in some of these questions. I think it has a broader significance than the author admits. I think the book's maybe a little bit too modest in that regard, but also it's being presented as a more conventional labor history. That would, it's not trying to get into that, but the language she uses makes me think it must have been conscious. Like she's using think locally, think globally, act locally, or affirmative action and social justice. These things are so contemporary. This language is so contemporary. I don't think she uses this term intersectionality, but that's really what's going on here. So that's it. That's my review of this book. I think it's great. I'm really glad I picked it up. It was something I got at the Zhejiang Public Library here. They have a really decent English book section, foreign language section there. Not as big as I would like, but I'm not complaining. But I'm surprised to find a book like this here, because labor history doesn't find its way into a lot of public libraries, unfortunately. University libraries is another thing, but public libraries sometimes don't have the strongest labor history collection as we would like. But they bought it, so they had a copy, and I was able to read it. So that's that for my review. So Sharon McConnell-Sidorick, Silk Stockings and Socialism. Check it out if you're interested in these themes. Let me know what you think of this. If there's any labor history you want me to review, please let me know, and I will, try to find it. If I won't be able to find it here, I'll be back in America over the summer, or back in Taiwan, where I'll have my full library. So I'll probably have some of them. One thing I will do is probably go get some classic labor history and haul them back to China with me, so I can study some of those books from the 60s and 70s and 80s. That's really an exciting period in labor history. A lot of old books, but one that I love coming back to quite often. So, but this review is about Silk Stockings and Socialism. Great book. And worth checking out, especially if you're interested in how class politics can be sustained more effectively by engaging with the identity politics that are emerging in a changing cultural environment. And I think that's what makes this story really relevant for us today. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think. If you have any questions or your own opinions, if you read this book, please let me know what you think. That's all. See you next time.